Okay, we're going to get started. There is notes if you want notes. I don't know if I have answers. Friday night, ask the pastors. Here. I don't know. Does it say there? 7 o'clock? We've had it a couple times. It's been a while since we had an Ask the Pastor. So Friday night, there's an Ask the Pastor here.
Well, it's a new thing happening Friday night.
Well, it'll occur every once in a while.
Oh, okay.
We haven't had in a while. Okay. So there may be more Ask the Pastors.
You can write it there.
Yeah. Okay, let's get started. Those who are listening at home, there's Ask the Pastor night this Friday. We're just talking about it. If you have questions, the pastors have answers. So Ask the Pastors night this Friday. Write those questions down. Make them really hard.
It's 7 o'clock Friday?
I don't know. Does it say 7 o'clock? Is it 7 o'clock? I'm thinking 7. What does the bulletin say? Mayor, what time is it? 7 o'clock? 7 o'clock, John.
7 o'clock here.
Yeah. But be here at 5:30, as usual. I'm just kidding. 7 o'clock. Joan can be here at 5:30. Pastor George will be here to meet her if she comes. I'm just kidding. 7 o'clock this Friday. That gives you you can come out to church Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday this week.
That's the first time I've seen that.
Yeah. Maybe we'll have more. If you really like them, maybe we'll have more of them. Okay, let's go to the Lord in prayer and ask His blessing for today's study in the book of 1 Samuel. Let's ask His blessing. Dear Heavenly Father, just thank you for those who are here, those who might be watching at home. We just thank you for your word. Continue to speak to us through this book, Lord, as we take a look at a time period so different than ours, and yet a lot of the same themes run throughout our own lives, Lord. So continue to teach us, continue to work on our hearts, Lord. And again, the idea is always to study the word and then apply the word. So help us to do that as well as we study this morning. Give Pastor Jim the strength as he's going to bring the word to us as well, Sunday morning service. So it'll be a very nice day of blessing to hear your word today. And so open up hearts and minds this morning as we go through these things. I pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, as usual, we are going to do a little review to open up your minds. It's an old teacher's trick to warm up, right? And just to review and get you guys thinking about the things that we went over last week and then prepared for the new information this week. So last week, we observed what was Saul's first major recorded act as king. He created a standing army consisting of 3,000 choice men from among the tribes of Israel. Now, he would directly command 2,000 of them as Jonathan, his son, would lead the other 1,000. No doubt, he had the Philistines in the front of his mind, who had made inroads into Israel and built garrisons in his own territory, in the tribal territory of Benjamin. He knew that he would eventually have to deal with them as he did the Ammonites years earlier. Now, Saul took his 2,000 men and set up camp along a known pass that weaved its way through the central part of Israel and really through the central part of the tribal territory of Benjamin. A city called Michmash was located very close to this pass on the north side, so we will call it the Michmash Pass. This would be a strategic location for any army to hold in order to keep supply lines open, and in case of enemy incursion, you would cut off enemy troop movement as well. Meanwhile, Jonathan was stationed to the south, very close to his hometown with his 1,000 troops. Now, possibly tired of his father's lollygagging and determined to make a name for himself, a young, impetuous Jonathan moved his men north and attacked a Philistine garrison that existed in Geba. Now, Geba, this city was about 4 miles north of Gibeah. And we'll see today through the maps, it was about a mile, maybe a little bit over a mile south of the Michmash Pass. So Michmash was on one side of the path. Geba is the first city on the other side of the pass. Now, more than likely, the Philistines had an important military leader or governor at this outpost in Geba. So when Jonathan attacked and destroyed the outpost, more than likely they killed the governor or the military leader, the person in charge, left in charge by the Philistines there in Geba. So this attack would definitely incite the Philistines to act against Israel. And they began to gather in force. And when the scouts returned with news of the many number of chariots and foot soldiers that marched towards Michmash, Saul needed to retreat. Now, Saul would then consult with Samuel. We don't get this in biblical history, but we know this from the inference of our chapter. He would consult with Samuel, who told him to fall back to Gilgal and wait for Samuel there for 7 days, at which time Samuel would offer sacrifices to the Lord on behalf of Saul and his army in Israel, all of Israel. Now, meanwhile, Saul would blow the shofar to gather as many reinforcements as he could muster at Gilgal. Now, the report was that he was the one that attacked the Philistine garrison. I don't want to put too much stock into that, but he attacked the Philistine garrison, and the idea was now all Israel was committed to this war. I mean, you had to volunteer. The attack was there. Israel had become odious to the Philistines, and war was imminent. So join the battle. But as more and more news of the Philistine numbers began to reach the camp of the Israelites, they began to lose heart, running and hiding among the caves and the cliffs. Some even ran east and forded the Jordan River to hide in the territory of Gad. This was a disaster. The situation was not one they didn't ask for. They had their king now. The king had his standing army. And the king was willing to go out and fight for the people. This is exactly what they asked for. Yet, now that it had come about, their faith failed them. As for the king, Saul had to stand on his faith amidst a very difficult circumstance. He was outmanned. He had inferior weapons, and we'll talk a little bit more about that today. And he had to deal with the fact that his army was dwindling each day in numbers because many continued to desert. The center of this test would be whether Saul would obey the Lord even when circumstances were at their worst and things looked horribly bad. Obey what? And what was Saul asked to obey exactly? He was told to wait in Gilgal for Samuel. Of course, he would understand this is the Lord's bidding. He was told that Samuel would ask the Lord's blessing for Saul. He could count on that. He was promised that if he obeyed, and Saul would certainly understand this, the Lord would go out and fight for him against his enemies. His reaction to this, to disobey the Lord because he panicked. He violated a direct commandment of the Lord with regard to all sacrifices. A non-Levitical priest was never to officiate any of the Lord's sacrifices. And when Samuel arrived, like a father who sees a son or his children making a mess, he says, "What did you do? What did you do?" Without repentance or apology, Saul began to blame shift, like many children do. First, Saul says that it was the people's fault. They were deserting him, and if they had never abandoned their post, this wouldn't have happened. Secondly, it was Samuel's fault. If he had just arrived on time as promised, this wouldn't have happened. Thirdly, it was certainly the Philistines' fault. If they hadn't gathered at Michmash and frightened his army, then this wouldn't have happened. And fourthly, and most importantly, it was God's fault. If he didn't have to seek the Lord's favor, then this wouldn't have happened. Saul's misguided conclusion was that he had no choice, and left with no choice, he simply tells Samuel, "I forced myself." This was written by J. Robert Van Noy, and he writes for Cornerstone Biblical Commentary. I thought it was interesting. He says, very short quote here, "The issue at stake was whether Saul would be a king under God or a king in place of God." Very fitting statement. Was he a person who was prepared to wait on the Lord in complete submission and trust, no matter what the circumstances might be? Or was he someone who viewed himself as above the word and the law of God? That was the question from Saul as we continue on today. So let's open our Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 13, and we're going to see what happens after Saul disobeyed, what is the result, and everything we go over today is going to lead up to the Battle of Michmash Pass. Now, I will tell you ahead of time, if you have read ahead, it's not much of a battle, and the Lord makes sure that that's what it is. But we are going to end up at a battle. But today's section is going to lead us right up to the battle, and all the lead up, everything that occurs right up until the battle. So we're going to be in chapter 13, all the way to the middle of chapter 14. So 1 Samuel chapter 13, and I'm going to read the rest of the chapter. I'm going to start in verse 15, and I'm going to read the rest of the chapter. 1 Samuel chapter 13, starting in verse 15, and I'll read to the end. So Saul disobeyed. Verse 15, "Then Samuel arose and went up from Gilgal to Gibeah of Benjamin. And Saul numbered the people who were present with him, about 600 men. Now Saul and his son Jonathan and the people who were present with them were staying in Gibeah of Benjamin, while the Philistines camped at Michmash. And the raiders came from the camp of the Philistines in 3 companies. One company turned towards Ophrah, to the land of Shual. And another company turned toward Beth Horon. And another company turned toward the border which overlooks the valley of Zeboim toward the wilderness. Now, no blacksmith could be found in all the land of Israel, for the Philistines says, otherwise the Hebrews will make swords and spears. So all Israel went down to the Philistines, each to sharpen his plowshare, his mattock, his axe, and his hoe. The charge was 2/3 of a shekel for the plowshares and the mattocks and the forks and the axes, and to fix the hoes. So it came about on the day of battle that neither sword nor spear was found in the hands of any of the people who were with Saul and Jonathan, but they were found with Saul and his son Jonathan." Verse 23, "And the garrison of the Philistines went out to the pass of Michmash." So let's focus on verses 15 and 16 to start. Top of page 1 in your notes. Everybody should have their notes. "Then Samuel rose and went from Gilgal to Gibeah of Benjamin, and Saul numbered the people who were present with him, about 600 men. Now Saul and his son Jonathan and the people which were present with them were staying at Gibeah of Benjamin, while the Philistines camped at Michmash." Let's take a look at these 2 verses. Samuel left Gilgal in disgust. He will not be joining Saul and his forces for this upcoming battle. You will read this section all the way through, and Samuel is conspicuously absent, with good reason. Instead, he travels back, it says, to Saul's hometown of Gibeah. I don't know why Gibeah necessarily, but he goes to Gibeah. He will not be joining Saul. Meanwhile, Saul is going to number his men. Did you see how many of his troops were left? And the number we see is about 600 men. Now, what is so interesting about this number of 600, let's think about it. This is down from the original 3,000, and also take into consideration any other volunteers that were added in the days after the blowing of the shofar, and as Saul moved his army back to Gilgal. Certainly there would be a number of volunteers that would have joined Saul. And by the time he got to Gilgal, and we don't know how many days he was there, or before some troops came to join him, but certainly within the 7 days he was waiting for Samuel, he had more troops. We don't know what that number is, but 3,000 minus 600 is 2,400 people. So we have to say a lot more than 2,400 men had deserted Saul's army. One thing that I will say about Saul here, Saul did not give up so easily. So we have a lot of negativity towards Saul with good reason, but Saul didn't quit. Saul didn't go home. Saul moved his troops. He wasn't going to give up, but rather he moved his men, it tells us, west of the town of Geba. All right, and we know that Geba is on the other side of the Michmash Pass. And you can obviously look at the looks like a paycheck down below, but it is the little map there. Let's take a look at that real quick. Now, the only thing I look at, I wanted you to give an idea of the Michmash Pass, and we can see the setup here. The only thing I might not agree with the map maker is they took a guess and said Saul's forces were up by Migron. Nobody knows where that is. And so he put Saul's forces and almost divided their forces. I don't think they were divided in any way. Matter of fact, when Jonathan goes missing, Saul is numbering, right, and did a little roll call, right? So if Saul and Jonathan's army were split apart like this, it would have been very difficult for Saul to have a roll call. So when Jonathan went missing, they do a roll call. I think their armies were together. They only had 600 men left. It doesn't make sense to me to divide them that way. But besides that, the map is pretty I think, accurate according to what the passage says. Geba, you can see it's a little over a mile south of the pass. Everybody see where Geba is? Probably Jonathan and Saul's forces were together in and around the outskirts of that town. That's where, and on the north side of the pass is Michmash. You see it there. So that's where the Philistines' forces were. And then you see the outpost that's built a little bit closer to the pass itself. And we'll talk about that. So this battlefield setup is not the last time the Israelite and the Philistines' armies were camped on opposite sides of a land formation. This is what armies do. During the time of Goliath, which is coming pretty soon, a valley called Elah separated the two armies. So we have the Philistines camped on one side of the valley, the Israelites camped on the other side of the valley. During this occasion, it would be the Michmash Pass, with the Philistines situated on the north side and the Israelites on the south side. Again, the map gives you just an idea of what the setup might have been, looked like. All right, everybody see that? Good. Psychological warfare. Let's take a look at verses 17 and 18. It says in these two verses, and the raiders came from the camp of the Philistines in 3 companies. One company turned toward Ophrah to the land of Shual, and another company turned towards Beth Horon, and another company turned towards the border which overlooks the valley of Zeboim toward the wilderness. So what's going on here? Verses 17 and 18 tells us that the Philistines sent out raiding parties from base camp in Michmash to 3 different areas in Israel. Now this action no doubt has dual purposes, and I think more than likely the initial purpose of this, no doubt, was to terrorize and oppress the inhabitants of the land, to show that even though Israel now had a king, it was the Philistines who were still superior and more powerful. And so as old Satan drives the thoughts and the intentions of a lot of leaders against Israel, I'm sure oppression, terrorizing of the inhabitants was of core value here. But I think there was another more practical reason for these raiding parties, not just to oppress. The raiders could freely attack Hebrew towns without resistance and take whatever supplies they could gather and bring those spoils back to camp. So another reason here is to bring back spoils. See, supply lines were not cut off for the Philistines. But why bother overextending yourself when you have Israelite supplies readily available? You have this massive army to feed. So it seems like another purpose for these raiders, and why the author adds this here is to say, while they're waiting for war and as they're sitting camped across from the Israelite army, they're going to go a raiding, and they're going to go gather some supplies. gather some spoils. So these raiders are sent in 3 separate directions. We see a northern company, a western company, and a southeastern company. The reason why the companies seem to avoid Saul's troop, and we're going to look at the map, and I want you to see that, they are in some way avoiding Saul and Jonathan's position. But it was not because the Philistines were afraid to engage Saul's army. They weren't afraid. They had them outnumbered, and they were very confident. It seems to be a calculated move to at least to avoid any confrontation at this time. So it seems that's the idea. They're going to avoid Saul's army and Jonathan's because they're not ready for a confrontation. They're getting themselves ready then. It was a calculated move. Now, here's another map down here just to give you an idea of the raiders and the position to the Michmash Pass. Here we have one arrow going north. It says the land of Shual and Ophrah. Can you see that to the north? So any city, as they move to the north, all the way up to Ophrah, they could take their spoils. They could loot. And so one company went up north, and that's actually out of the territory of Benjamin into the territory of Ephraim. And so they would raid all the way to Ophrah. Another one went back to where they came. They went back west. The Philistines came in that direction. As you track the arrow that goes on your map to the left, you can see one of the first cities they would have hit was Mizpah. Can you see Mizpah there on their route? But if they went a little further north, they would have hit Bethel. But you see lower Beth Horon, that's the thought of where that might be. They traveled west, and they looted those cities. And then we have another company, group of men. They went towards the Jordan River. You can see they actually go west. You can see the Zeboim Valley right there, and that area right there, a little bit to the west of Gilgal, that's another area they looted. And so they spread out in 3 different directions. It gives you an idea of what they were doing here. All right. It seems like they stayed north of the Michmash Pass and then, like I said, looted those cities and gathered supplies. Outmanned and inferior weaponry. So the author lets us know what the problem was before the battle. The main issue, the last 5 verses. He says, "Now no blacksmith could be found in all the land of Israel, for the Philistines said, otherwise the Hebrews will make swords and spears. So all Israel went down to the Philistines, each to sharpen his plowshare, his mattock, his axe, and his hoe. The charge was 2/3 of a shekel for the plowshares, the mattocks, the forks, and the axes, and to fix the hoes. So it came about on the day of battle, that would be this time right now. By the time they're ready to fight, that neither sword nor spear was found in the hands of any of the people who were with Saul and Jonathan, but they were found with Saul and his son Jonathan." So in other words, the leadership had them. And the garrison of the Philistines went out to the pass of Michmash. And so what is the author telling us here? What is Samuel saying? Now, in the past lessons, we got to draw some information, right? We discussed a little bit, if you recall, the background of the Philistines. They were originally seafaring people who sailed in the southwestern shoreline of Canaan. They were Greeks, or had Greek heritage, who apparently brought with them a knowledge and supply of a very sturdy metal, and this metal is iron. Archaeology indicates that the Philistines introduced the metal of iron to Canaan in the form of weapons, agricultural tools, and jewelry. The Israelites, along with the rest of the people of Canaan, even the Amorites or the Girgashites or the Jebusites, they didn't have iron. This is considered the Bronze Age, so they wouldn't have used iron, they would have used bronze. At least that's what the history shows us, archaeology. Now, what's the deal? I mean, what's the big deal? Metal's a metal, right? Well, if you study these metals, no. If 2 men were dueling, one with a bronze sword and the other with an iron sword, guess what happens? The man with the iron sword could shatter the bronze sword with one swing. That's the differences in the 2 metals. So it is not that Israel had no weapons. And the idea is they didn't have wooden pitchforks. They weren't a rabble, picking up anything they could find, sticks on the ground. So the idea wasn't that they had no weapons. They didn't have no weapons to kill. They certainly did, but they had much inferior weapons than the Philistines. They were definitely outgunned here, to use an expression. So it was a major problem here. What they had was definitely not made of iron, and certainly inferior to what the Philistines have. So I'm going to give a sporting analogy. It would be like the Philadelphia Eagles and the Green Bay Packers, right? They played last week, okay? So imagine this football game. And the Packers having the latest helmets, which they did, and other protective equipment, while the Eagles don those old leather helmets with the non-existent shoulder pads. I don't even know if they had shoulder pads. I mean, it looks like they're regular shoulders when they play, right? Those early days of football, barely any pads, leather helmets. I'll take the Packers any day. Could you imagine two football teams playing a football game with the differences in protective equipment nowadays and back then? The only people who had any advanced weapons, and they might have even had iron swords and spears, was Jonathan and Saul, the leadership. So that was a problem that Samuel's letting us know. It wasn't just that they only had 600 against an unnumerable amount of people for the Philistines, soldiers, troops. But it's that their weapons were inferior. Therefore, we see a high level of control the Philistines achieved over some areas of Israel, and that they were able to keep the Israelites from even possessing metal tool-making equipment. It talks about an iron-edged plow, or even if they would have had a bronze-edged plow, right, was far better than wood. But in order for an Israelite farmer to sharpen or repair a metal-edged farm implement, he had no choice but at this point in time to go to the Philistines and pay out of pocket. Because of this Philistine policy, Israel had no practicing blacksmith in the land. Now, this does not mean that there was no Israelite with the ability to work metal. I mean, there were certainly people with this ability. But at this point in time, the blacksmiths were put out of business, to give you an idea. They were put out of business, and they couldn't work. They couldn't work. And so we don't know how long this occurred, but if it occurred over the last decade or so, 10 or 12 years, this is what had been occurring over the last 10 or 12 years. The Philistines had been making some inroads into Israel, and it even affected their fighting equipment. So whatever the Israel men had used in battle, it was markedly inferior to the Philistines' army equipment, and this was a problem. And the author's letting us know. Well, this is what they were up against. Now, I put this little funny picture there. That is a plowshare. If you look at the numbers, I didn't put any labels there, but if you look at the number 6, can you see it? That's where the blade would be of the plowshare. So 6 is the blade. That would be made of iron for the Philistine farmers, and more than likely for the Israelite farmers, they would have a bronze blade. And so that's where the blade is. I don't know if they would be able to take that off and just take the blade down over to Philistine territory and get that taken off, or they have to take the whole plowshare. More than likely not. They could take the blade off, but they would have to get that sharpened. I just thought to give you a little visual there, that's what that looked like. So the very last act of the Philistines we see in the very last verse, or part of the verse right there in 23. And it says this in chapter 13, that their last act was to build a garrison on the Michmash Pass. And we saw it in our picture here. Now, this is a different Hebrew word than the one used in 13:3, the garrison that Jonathan attacked in Geba. Now, I explained that the Hebrew word netliv in 13:3 carried with it the idea of permanence, like a permanent building, a permanent structure, and the fact that there was an important military leader, or more than likely a governor of some sort, who was posted in that garrison that Jonathan would have killed while destroying that garrison. The garrison, or the matzab here, was a temporary, I want us to think of it as like a sentry tent built very near the edge of the north side of the pass, away from the main body of soldiers. So you had the main body of soldiers by Michmash. And then away from that command tent, there was another large tent or structure temporarily built right up on the Michmash Pass. And this was a matzav. This is a little bit different. The sentries or the lookouts stationed at this tent were charged with watching the pass very closely and would probably report back periodically to the main command tent that was positioned closer to the town of Michmash. It's the idea here. So that is setting the stage for this battle that's going to occur. But before the battle occurs, Jonathan is going to be up to something, and we're going to see that in the first 14 verses of chapter 14. I will just say, now that I have a little pause, does anybody have any questions over chapter 13 or the first or the last 8 or 9 verses of that chapter? Any comments or anything, any clarification points need to be made? When I wrote these notes, there's a 7th page. On the 7th page was a paragraph. I might even save it for next week. And I felt like writing the paragraph, and the paragraph was about how I don't think anything in the Bible when it comes to war and the loss of life is funny. And it was a necessary holy war when the Israelites took life, was to stop the spread of evil and was necessary. But overall, I don't think it's funny. It's not a funny thing. But and the reason why I wrote that paragraph is because I just always read chapter 14 and laugh. There's something that interesting and funny with God have a sense of humor as reading this and seeing human nature. And so I just wanted, I wrote that paragraph because I didn't want everybody to think that I thought war was funny. But anyway, I do read this and chuckle, and I'm going to explain why I feel that way when I read this section. So I'm going to read the first 14 verses of chapter 14. So actually the first 15 verses of chapter 14. And I'm going to read it, I guess, dynamically. I might interject a little bit, okay, as I read, just to add a little bit of what I'm thinking as I read this. So it is on the paper. If you were following the paper, Joan, you'd have to go from bold print to bold print. So the first 5 verses is the first set of bold print, and as you move back, you'd have to look at the bold print. 6 through 10 is in the next page, and then you could follow that. So if you don't have a Bible, just follow the bold. If not, just listen. I'm just going to read it, the first 15 verses, and just listen how I read it here. Just like I'm telling you a story, like I'm reading you a bedtime story. So you're sitting there and you just, yeah, so. All right, so all you need is your ears, don't worry. All right, everybody good? All right, first 15 verses of, and I did that on purpose when we'll stop because we're going to deal with the battle next week. Let's see what happens with Jonathan. Now the day came that Jonathan, the son of Saul, said to the young man who was carrying his armor, "Come, let us cross over to the Philistine garrison." This is this little tent that is on the other side, but he did not tell his father. Now Saul was staying in the outskirts of Gibeah under the pomegranate tree, which is in Migron, and we don't know where that is. And the people who were with him were about 600 men. And Ahijah, the son of Ahitub, Ichabod's brother, the son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the priest of the Lord at Shiloh, was wearing an ephod. And the people did not know that Jonathan had gone. Now, between the passes by which Jonathan sought to cross over to the Philistines' garrison, there was a sharp crag on one side and a sharp crag on the other side, and the name of the one was Bozez, and the name of the other was Seneh. And we're going to talk about that. It's a very steep rock face cliff. The one crag rose up on the north side opposite Michmash, and the other on the south opposite Geba. All right, so we're there, and we're going to get the picture as we go on. Then Jonathan said to the young man who was carrying his armor, "Come, let us cross over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. Perhaps the Lord will work for us, for the Lord is not restrained to save by many or by few." Now his armor bearer said to him, "Do all that is in your heart. Turn yourself, and here I am with you according to your desire." Then Jonathan said, "Behold, we will cross over to the men and reveal ourselves to them. If they say to us, wait, we come to you, then we will stand in our place, which would have been inside the pass, right, and not go up to them. But if they say, come up to us, then we will go up. For the Lord, this is the signal, the Lord has given them into our hands, and this shall be the sign to us. Well, both of them revealed themselves to the garrison of the Philistines. The Philistines said this, behold, Hebrews are coming out of the holes which they have hidden themselves. And so you can imagine these two lone Hebrews, and of course the teasing and the conversation. Look at these two Hebrews. Look at these guys. They're coming out of their hidey holes. So the men of the garrison hailed Jonathan and his armor and say, come up to us. We will tell you something. In other words, come on up. We want to show you something. Come on up here. And you can imagine this scene of these two lone Hebrews and these young Philistine soldiers taunting them. Come on up. We want to show you something. I'm on verse 13. Then Jonathan climbed up on his hands and feet. We're going to talk about, because it's a crag, that's why they had to climb up on their hands and feet, and with his armor bearer behind him. And they fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer put some to death after him. That first slaughter which Jonathan and his armor bearer made was about 20 men within about half a furrow and an acre of land. And we're going to stop there. So I mistakenly put verse 15 in your notes. We're stopping at verse 14. So we're just doing the first 14 verses. So I got to change the title. All right, let's talk about the first 5 verses and let's set the stage. This is the lead up to the battle. And make sure we know what's going on here. I'm just going to once again read the first 5 verses of chapter 14. And Joan, in the notes, you're on page 3. Okay, the bottom of page 3. A reckless idea or faith. A reckless idea or faith. Now the day came that Jonathan, the son of Saul, said to the young man who was carrying his armor, come, let us cross over to the Philistines' garrison. That was on the other side. But he did not tell his father. Saul was staying in the outskirts of Gibeah under the pomegranate tree, which is in Migron, and the people who were with him were about 600 men. And Ahijah, the son of Ahitub, Ichabod's brother, the son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the priest of the Lord, is at Shiloh, was wearing an ephod. And the people did not know that Jonathan had gone. Between the passes by which Jonathan sought to cross over to the Philistine garrison, there was a sharp crag on one side and a sharp crag on the other side. And the name of one of both was Bozez, and the name of the other Seneh. The one crag rose up on the north opposite of Michmash, and the other on the south opposite Geba. Now, the question for me when I read these chapters was centered around the dynamic between a young, eager Jonathan and the cautious, plotting, and planning Saul. How much leeway was given to Jonathan by his father? Did Jonathan's brash spirit bother Saul, or did he encourage this attitude as long as he was included in Jonathan's plans? Now, either way here, no matter what their situation was, Jonathan's going to make a plan, and he doesn't include Saul. As a matter of fact, he doesn't include anything. A plan on its surface, it seems reckless at best. I don't know if you read this and said, wait, hold on a second. Jonathan is planning to attack the Philistine outpost using just himself and his armor bearer. That's it. Nobody else is going to know. None of the 600, none of their best buddies, just these 2 men. Meanwhile, his father is sitting idly, it says, under the pomegranate tree, which is in Migron. Now, a location exactly is unknown. But from my guess, Migron is a place that is outside of Geba somewhere. But why a pomegranate tree? And what's the deal with the author adding about that he was by a pomegranate tree? Well, very simply, it is usual that a recognizable tree or other landmark was used to position a military command tent with the military general, Saul, because it was easier to describe to a messenger or other necessary people where to find the leadership. The command tent's there, the leader's there by the whatever landmark. And so the author's letting us know that Saul chose a locally known pomegranate tree, and that's where he set up his camp. In other words, in addition to being a prime camping spot, which was always reserved for the leadership, the elite, an exceptionally big tree, or in this case, an exceptionally desirable tree, was a good place for the command center. Now, as we think about this situation with Jonathan and Saul, I just wanted to give you some food for thought. I found these remarks by Tom Bradford thoughtful and well said about the situation just before Jonathan once again incites a battle. So what's going on here? How do we set the stage? This is what Tom Bradford said. This is second paragraph on page 4. An unflattering picture of Saul has been emerging, and I'm sorry to say the picture is very much like the stereotype of a modern politician. He talked a good game, but wouldn't act unless there was sufficient personal benefit that at the same time also minimized any personal risk. He purported to be the leader of Israel, but generally just observed where the parade was already headed and then grabbed the baton and jumped in front to take the credit. His courage was measured primarily by the level of support from those who agreed with him, and he melted quickly if he felt the opposition was too great. And while at times he ordered the people to scrupulously obey the law of Moses or bear the consequences, he also played fast and loose with Jehovah's commandments, and he felt he was generally above the law. Saul's outward demeanor of bombast and bravado masked an inward insecurity, timidity, and lack of character. Everything that God demanded of a king, Saul could not deliver. But of course, the Lord knew that, because that was at the heart of the reason he chose Saul in the first place. Saul was not only stereotypical of modern politicians, but also of the Middle Eastern kings and small-time potentates of that era. King Shaul, Saul, was exactly what those tribal leaders of Israel had in mind as a model of a monarchy that they felt sure was the answer to all their problems. So we take a look at what's going on here. We have a Saul who's sitting by the pomegranate tree, and he's not doing much of anything. And then we have a young, brash Jonathan going up to start a fight. My pop, yeah.
I'm just going to say that it was, this is the same kind of Saul, same kind of person as Saul, when David arrives on the scene, and you have them, the Philistines on one side of the mount of Elah, the valley of Elah, and the Israelites on the other side, and he's just sitting there.
Yeah.
And David shows up with 5 stones and takes on Goliath. Same situation that will come again, and David will bail him out of that one.
Right. I think, and that's a great point. Thank you for making that point. That we look at Saul's character, and we do apply what Tom said and what we're thinking and through as we look at this battle. I mean, it should have been King Saul himself should have went down there and took care of Goliath in the name of the Lord, right? And somebody, but a young David with 5 stones went down there, and yes, indecisive. All right, he didn't go down to fight Goliath because King Saul was afraid and wouldn't risk it. Right? So we see that character a little bit later on, yes, in the battle against Goliath in the valley of Elah. So we're going to see this time and again. Good. Now the author continues the narrative by telling us the other major disadvantage Israel had at this time: numbers. It was numbers. Saul was leading only about 600 men. But notice what Saul did now that he had lost Samuel's support. Samuel's gone. He's not on the battlefield. Now, we don't know any of the details about how this happened. I can't pull from any other scripture. I can only pull from what I see here. All right, so there's no details. There's nothing to give us background. So what happens here is anyone's good guess. But Saul, at some point in time, summoned who was the acting high priest of Israel. This would normally have been Samuel's place beside Saul, and it should have been. But Samuel's upset. The reason why this is so surprising is because we have heard nothing. I mean, absolutely nothing about the priesthood since Samuel took over as judge over Israel decades earlier. We don't know where they're at. We don't know where they're serving. We know the ark resides in Kiriath Jearim, but what has become of Eli's family line of priests? They were alive and they move on. And where exactly do they serve during this time? Is it at different places? Where are they at? Now we know this, that a large contingent of priests end up in the town of Nob. And Nob is a little closer to Jerusalem, just on the outskirts of Jerusalem. So it's south of where we're at. So we have Nob, and a large amount of priests are there at Nob some years in the future. But we don't have a biblical history or background for the establishment of the Nob sanctuary. There will be a sanctuary there, but when was it established? There's not much information. So all of a sudden, a priest named Ahijah was with Saul at the command tent, at the pomegranate tree. Where did he come from? And who was he? Now, Ahijah, here in this passage, was the great-grandson of Eli. The author gives us a short family tree, so we know where he came from. Looking at the text backwards, like if we read backwards in the text, we have Eli, who bore Phinehas. Now, Phinehas was one of his wicked sons who died on the battlefield and lost the Ark of the Covenant to the Philistines years earlier. You remember Phinehas. He's one of those who ordered his servants with the three-pronged forks to go and stick their fork in the sacrifices. So he was wicked. Now, his wife bore Ichabod. Ichabod was his son, Phinehas' son. So we have Eli and Phinehas, and then we have Phinehas' grandson, Ichabod. Remember, Ichabod means, where's the glory? Where's the glory? And Ahitub, who bore Ahijah. So Ahitub was Ichabod's brother. All right, so probably was an older brother, and he bore Ahijah. And so that's the grandson. Everybody get that, where we get Ahijah all of a sudden? Great-grandson of Eli. Now remember that the priestly line of Eli was under judgment, but that judgment occurs some years in the future. In other words, that judgment doesn't hit yet. It will soon. And it'll happen at Nob, if you've read ahead. So apparently, wherever he was serving, and we just don't know where it was, Ahitub was the recognized high priest, at least by Saul, even though we've also talked about that Eli's family line was from Ithamar and not from Eleazar. And Eleazar was supposed to produce the high priest in the land. Somehow, some way, Ithamar's family line was the one now serving as high priest, and that was Eli's line from Ithamar. Zadok, who was certainly living at this time, but we don't know nothing about his whereabouts, is Zadok. He's going to come on the scene, and David's going to correct this. He's going to raise up Zadok, and he's going to place him in his rightful place. Zadok is of the family line of Eleazar, and so that'll be remedied in the future. Now we know Ahijah was in this position because he was wearing the ephod. What's an ephod? This was the high priest's ritual vest, and we're going to see next week it contains the Urim and Thummim stones. Another thing that was given to the priesthood to determine God's will. So this is a ritual vest officially worn by the high priest, and it had the Urim and Thummim stones in there as well. And this is what Ahijah had on. So he has the ritual vest of the high priest. The ritual vest would have been the same one worn by his great-grandfather Eli, when Eli was serving. The idea is that somehow Saul summoned Ahijah since there was a temporary break in communication with Samuel. So this was Saul's attempt to have the Lord in the battle. And so Ahijah is in the scene. He is the high priest, acting high priest now with the Urim and Thummim stone with the ritual vest. Everybody good with that? Now, the author continues by telling us that nobody knows what Jonathan and his armor bearer have planned. I mean, they didn't tell anybody. This is a private plot just between the two of them. They walk the mile or so to the Michmash Pass, and they enter the pass at a spot that had two sharp crags on either side. Now, Kenny asked, what was a crag, right? And now he's gone. A crag is a steep rock formation. In other words, this is not a gradual drop into the pass. This is pretty steep. Now, this became such a famous story that the crags were named Bozez and Sinai. I mean, that's how this works. So this is a very famous story, and now we got to name things, and now we have these two crags named. And of course, looking at the rock formation, it's a guess that because we know up to the top left corner of this picture, close up of Bozez and Sinai, we see Michmash is up and to the left, pretty close to the pass. The Philistine army would have been laid out in here, right up to the side and around the pass, right where the city is. And then off away from the main tent would have been another garrison tent that would have been right by this crag. So when you look at the area, you can see the crags. You see that very steep rock formation. So the guess is that's where it is, and it looks pretty good to me. So you would imagine a Philistine outpost, a temporary sentry tent, sitting very close to that edge on the northern side. And Jonathan and his armor bearer climb down. They get into the pass. All right, so that. Now the plan and the indication. Verses 6 through 10. Then Jonathan said to the young man who was carrying his armor, "Come, let us cross over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. Perhaps the Lord will work for us, for the Lord is not restrained to save by many or by few." His armor bearer said to him, "Do all that is in your heart, turn yourself, and here I am with you according to your desire." In other words, I'm with you. And Jonathan said, "Behold, we will cross over to the men and reveal ourselves to them. And if they say, 'Wait, we will come to you,' then we will stand in our place and not go up to them. And if they do come down, we'll fight them there," basically. "But if they say, 'Come up to us,' then we will go up, for the Lord has given them into our hands, and this shall be the sign to us." Now, sometimes it's hard to read a passage in the Bible and really, I mean really place ourselves in the shoes of those ancient Israelites and the circumstances they find themselves in. Now, I have given you enough background for thought. So I ask this honestly. How many of us, if let's say we were Jonathan's armor bearer, would regard Jonathan's plan as good, commendable faith, or a suicidal, brash attempt to test God by doing something foolish? Of course the Lord can deliver by smaller numbers, but why not go into the battle with the 600 rather than the 2? And so it is an honest question. Is this faith or foolishness? Now, I had to add another of Tom Bradford's quotes because when he wrote this, I couldn't stop laughing. I read this and I just absolutely giggled. This is what Tom said. He says, "My nature is such that not only would I probably not take Jonathan's approach, but if I was that armor bearer, I'd ask for an immediate transfer." That's what he said. So, yes. But this armor bearer, loyal and having his own faith, went along with the plan without reservation. That's what that language states. He's with his guy. Jonathan's his guy. All right, we're going. We're going to do this. So, foolish or not, he's going to go with just the two of them and make a plan. Now, here's the plan, crazy or not. They would climb down into the pass, and they would make themselves known to the Philistine garrison. Hey, however they made themselves known. If the sentries said, "Wait until we come to you," the idea was Jonathan and his armor bearer would stand their ground and fight in the pass. If they came down, then they would take the battle to them in the pass. But if they said, "Come up to us," then this was a direct signal from Jehovah that he approved of this action and would be with them, and despite being outnumbered, give them a resounding victory. That's the plan. All right, sound good? 2 against, we know, at least 20. Maybe there was more in the sentry tent, but we know it was a 10-to-1 ratio when we read ahead. So they were outnumbered. I don't know if this is a good plan. Now, this is based on very good scriptural evidence about numbers. When it comes to fighting holy war, all right, that's why a small David with a slingshot was able to go down against Goliath, because it was holy war. It was about the Lord. Jonathan would have fought of Gideon, who won a battle with only 300 men against a massive army. Size and numbers don't matter to the Lord. And I said David used the same thinking when he approached a seasoned soldier with superior size and experience, only to defeat him with nothing more than a shepherd's sling. Whether part faith or part foolishness, it doesn't matter, right? Because we see in this passage the Lord was going to honor Jonathan's commitment to him. The Lord was going to honor this personally. The Lord was going to signal Jonathan using a pagan Philistine soldier. That was the signal. Jonathan set it up. The Lord said, okay, I'm going to give you the signal. And so the Lord can work through anybody, even a pagan who doesn't know him. Now, I want you to think about how this soldier's response was in the divine plan. I mean, doesn't that blow your mind? Doesn't that blow your mind that they said, that this young Philistine soldier said, come on up. And the Lord's in control. So now the plan will be executed. And we'll finish today. We're taking a look at the last 5 verses here real quickly. The plan executed. When both of them revealed themselves to the garrison of the Philistines said, right? Listen to their attitude. Behold, Hebrews are coming out of the holes where they have hidden themselves. So like young soldiers to say, right? Arrogant, cocky, definitely had the numbers, so they had nothing to fear. So the men of the garrison hailed Jonathan and his armor bearer and said, come on up to us, come on up. We want to show you something. We want to tell you something. I just had to crack up when I read this. We are 3,000 years removed from this story. This story occurred 3,000 years ago, and yet these Philistine, pagan, young soldiers sound exactly like a young man today. If they come on up here, we want to show you something, or we want to tell you something. The more things change, the more things stay the same. I mean, it just cracked me up that this could happen today. It doesn't matter that it was 3,000 years ago, and Philistia was so different than the United States of America. I mean, you have this youth, this brashness of a soldier. Come on up. Then Jonathan climbed up. Oh, wait, then Jonathan said to the armor bearer, come after me, for the Lord has given them into the hands of Israel. And Jonathan climbed up on his hands and feet with his armor bearer behind him, and they fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer put some to death after him. That first slaughter which Jonathan and his armor bearer made was about 20 men within a half a furrow in an acre of land. So what happens here? Jonathan and his armor bearer reached the crag on the south side of the pass. They climbed down. They, at some point, made themselves known to the Philistine guards overlooking the surface below. The soldiers joke among themselves and look, the Hebrews must be coming out of their hidey holes. It's just 2 lone Hebrew soldiers. They must have been so confident, so full of bravado. They also knew that when their big and bad army came marching into town, that a portion of the Israelite troops ran and hid themselves. But at the same time, I say this, it must have been also very suspicious for them to see only 2 Hebrews separated from the rest of their army. So maybe part of this was they thought it was a trap. Having no desire to go down into the pass, only to be ambushed, they say to the 2 Hebrews, come on up here, we want to show you something, we want to tell you something. It says exactly. So it seems like they had no desire to go down there, just in case. But invite Jonathan and his armor bearer up. So that's all Jonathan and his armor bearer need to hear. To them and to Jonathan, God was with them. The rock face was so steep, and we talked about this as well, it's a rock face, that's a crag, a very steep rock face. It was so steep that it says they both climbed up on their hands and feet. That's what the author is adding there. That's why they're on their hands and feet. So they didn't come just on their feet. They had to use their hands. They climb up. Now, you didn't know Jonathan was a rock climber, and I bet he didn't even have a safety rope. So he's climbing up, hands at his feet, armor bearer, right up the steep face. And obviously, when you look at this, the steep grade actually worked to their advantage, and it probably hid their approach from the group of Philistine soldiers who probably thought that those two Hebrews returned to their camp or their hidey holes. I'm sure that these sentries didn't think at all that they would be attacked by two Hebrew men. And so probably being hid by the steep grade, they climb up the crag and they make their way up to the top to the garrison here, probably without, their presence without, being spotted. Now the initial slaughter was 20 men. And I don't know if more ran back to the main camp of the Philistines, but we have 20 men who fell before Jonathan as armor bearer. That's 10-to-1 ratio. The plot of land on which the skirmish occurred was, you take the language, it was a narrow patch that was equivalent to a patch of land plowed by a yoke of oxen in a day, was the idea. In other words, this area wasn't wide open so that Jonathan and his armor bearer would be easily surrounded. So it was more of a tunnel-like area, a very small patch. In other words, they would be able to work as a team. Jonathan and his armor bearer would be able to work as a team, as Jonathan would dispatch one or two soldiers at a time, while his armor bearer would finish anyone still alive as Jonathan would kind of move on to the next man. So Jonathan would fight the first man. He would only fight one or two soldiers at a time, kill off one or both of them, and then the armor bearer would clean up behind Jonathan. This is how this occurred. This is not to diminish this heroic feat of thinking Jonathan attacked the main army of the Philistines. That's not what happened, but this feat is still unbelievable. 10-to-1, these odds. But God would also have to intervene because this slaughter would have alerted the main Philistine camp. And we're going to see next week as we move on, we'll see how the Lord inserts himself into the battle of Michmash Pass. So as you read on 15 and the rest of the chapter, you will see how the Lord will eventually have to intervene here. But this is a great beginning to this battle. Jonathan killed 20 of these sentries, okay, and the Lord protects him and his armor bearer as they're successful. And we'll see what happens next week, as, of course, the main Philistine army will be alerted, and we'll see what occurs and how the Lord steps in and intervenes. Real quick, because I ran out of time.
What type of weaponry do you think that they had? Arrows or spears to do 20-to-1 ratio?
Well, it says, remember, that Jonathan and his armor bearer probably had the best, and they might have even had iron swords and spears. They were equipped because the chapter says that the army, the other 600, or the other military men, did not have the same weaponry, but Jonathan and Saul did. So only the elite, of course, the king and his princes, had the best equipment. So they would have been able to fight these Philistine sentries properly with almost equal swords and spears, I would think. Again, not to diminish what the Lord did here for Jonathan in defeating this sentry tent. Doesn't matter. 10-to-1 is bad odds. But weaponry-wise, Jonathan and Saul had the best weaponry that would be available to them because they were the king and the prince. And so we're to see. So Jonathan starts a battle. The Lord, of course, is going to finish this battle. And we're going to see next week and study what happened at the Battle of Michmash Pass. So read ahead. I'm sorry I can't field any questions because we did run out of time. But if you do have any questions on the side, please don't hesitate to ask if you have any other questions. But we do have to get going and get ready for service. So anyway.
Battles in the Bible?
What's that?
This battle's in the Bible?
This battle's in the rest of the chapter. So if you read ahead, you start with verse 15. You can read what happens. It is there. The Battle of Michmash Pass.
And this is in the Bible.
It's right there in 1 Samuel. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for all that came out this morning to hear your word, and we're just thankful that we see so many applications. We see you at work amongst your people, Lord, and we're just encouraged that no matter what happens, you're always in control. You're sovereign, controlling the events of humans from the start, from creation on. You are the controller of human history, and we can bank on that you can still control human history, and it's such an encouragement to us, Lord. So thank you for all that came out this morning. Again, I just pray for Pastor Jim as he brings the word to us as we prepare our hearts for Sunday morning service. And so I just pray that we continue to apply these things to our lives and bring them to our work week and always be able to learn whatever you are willing to teach us through these ancient Israelites and through the book of 1 Samuel, Lord. And I pray all this, Lord, in Jesus' name, and thanks for your word again. Amen.